Great. Well, welcome everybody. This is Mary Rowe sitting on 57th Street in New York City on a nice spring day here. Delighted to have participants from around the world to talk with us together about why the world needs an urban sustainable development goal. We've got terrific panelists to inform us about this particular campaign and why it's important and how we can all contribute to it. Eugenie Birch is with us, Maruxa Cardama, Cynthia Rosenzweig, and Platt. And each of them will give a brief presentation, and then we're going to have questions that people can pose, and we can have some open discussion. I can appreciate for some people this may be your first global webinar, and it's certainly one of the first that we've tried to do with participants from around the world. So bear with us if we have a few technical challenges. Hopefully we won't. The first thing I'm going to ask is that everybody mute their microphone, and that makes it easier for people to hear. The second thing is, if you would, you'll see every participant should see on their screen a place to actually chat. It's at the bottom right of your control panel. And what would be terrifically interesting for us is if you could at some point during the call just keystroke in what city you're calling in from, so that we'll be able to see who we have participation from. We have your names, but we don't have the city that you've come in from. So that would be great for us to have a sense of that. And then when it comes time for questioning, as you can see, Courtney's put up an image here to tell you, you can either type your questions into the question box on the side of the screen, and I'll read it, and the presenters can respond, or other participants can respond too, or you can raise your hand, in which case I can we can be brave here and see. We'll try, hoping that everyone's audio works, and I can acknowledge you that. So we'll experiment a little bit on whether you ask a question verbally or whether I read it. But to be better safe than sorry, better that you input it as well, and then we'll have it up. Courtney Smith is the person that's doing all the technical stuff. She's here at my right hand, troubleshooting as we go. Hopefully the technology will hold, and we'll have a good conversation. So, we're recording this session, and we'll post it, and we'll make it available to other folks to post links so that you can show it to colleagues, and we can continue to have this conversation over the next several weeks when things are going to really become pretty intense. Around whether or not there will be a goal like this. So the first person I'd like to call on is Eugenie Birch. She's the chair of the World Urban Campaign, and she's the co-director of the Penn Institute for Urban Research. She also happens to be my board chair at the Municipal Art Society, so we are very proud of Jeannie and delighted that she's joining us today. So Jeannie, over to you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's wonderful to see everybody here, or hear everybody here at this very important webinar. It's very important because, as you saw, the title is, Why Does the World Need an Urban SDG? As you may or may not know, in September, the General Assembly of the United Nations will receive recommendations from the Open Working Group, which is a subcommittee of 30 voting seats representing 70 members of member states, will receive recommendations for what is called the framework for the post-2015 agenda. This is a lot of words, meaning the goals and targets of the Sustainability Development Goals designed to replace the Millennium Goals, which will expire in 2015, will be provided to the General Assembly for a year's worth of study. And then they will vote on them, and they should take place in 2015. Among the targets and goals that are being discussed right now is the one that is on sustainable cities and human settlements. Now, what's important about the process that has been going on for the past year, following actually the Rio Plus 20 conference, is that the United Nations, through this subcommittee called the Open Working Group, has been investigating what these goals and targets should be. They started out with a list of 39 goals, or what they're calling focal areas, which could be areas that would be potential goals, and over the course of the year have discussed and heard representatives from technical groups as well as from the member states about what's important in terms of setting priorities for development in the next 20 years, and have winnowed this list down first to 19 and now to 16. The current language, which is being explored by the Open Working Group this week, The Open Working Group has been meeting monthly for the past year and has 2 more meetings before it sends its recommendations to the Secretary General, and then he will forward them on to the General Assembly. The current wording, if you could go back in that slide, please, Courtney, we'll just go over the wording of what is being discussed in the focal area under the titles of Build Inclusive, Safe, Sustainable Cities and Human Settlements are several targets. Each goal will have something like 3 to 5 targets, and those targets will be measured with indicators as yet to be selected. And this list in front of you summarizes some of the proposed targets, probably the top line targets of what would be aimed for in a standalone goal. So the first one we have here is enhancing urban planning that promotes youth participation, gender equality, compact cities, and healthy rural settlements. I would bring to your attention that this particular goal that we are talking about includes appreciation of all kinds of human settlements, not just cities, and that its major aim is to create a situation where we have balanced territorial development in nations, in regions and nations. So this is what we are attempting to achieve here with this goal and some of these targets. The second target that you see listed on the list is to, sorry, I've just lost the screen here. Very good. Is strengthening resilience to reduce the loss of lives, assets, housing, and infrastructure, particularly to natural and man-made disasters. Resilience, as you know, is a key issue for global development. The third, again, these are general wording, giving concepts of what would be covered in such a goal. The third target in proposed language is preventing slums by ensuring equitable access to affordable, durable housing, basic services, and land tenure security. Fourth target under consideration is providing access to affordable and accessible transport for shorter, safer, and healthier commutes. And lastly, ensuring access to public space for safe, connected communities and public services. As I said, this is proposed language to show and demonstrate what this goal might encompass and to underline the fact that if there is no standalone goal on cities, many of these aspects that we're talking about are likely not to be covered. And if you look closely here, you will see that what we're talking about in many instances is the built environment, the spatial aspects of development, and the fact underlining all of this is the fact that place matters. It's very important to think about how place matters in terms of successful development, development that is sustainable, and development that will help frame the other goals that will likely go forward. Likely going forward will be sectoral goals, goals on water, goals on health, goals on food security. There's universal appreciation that these are totally necessary. But when you think about it, if you don't get the cities right, it's going to be very hard to achieve these other goals. And why are we so concerned about this? Well, for obvious reasons. In the developed world, urbanization has reached 80%, and in the developing world, in the next 20 years that we're talking about, urbanization will move to probably 60% in many instances, and higher in other instances, maybe a little bit lower in other instances. But the point is, the urbanization trajectory is fast-paced movement, and getting the arrangements of where people are living is going to be absolutely essential to where we're going. I'd like to turn this over now to our next speaker.
Indeed. Well, Jeannie, thanks very much. This is Maruxa Cardama. I am currently coordinator of Coalition for Sustainable Cities and Regions in the UN Development Agenda, a mouthful basically to say that it's a coalition of the willing, a group of different organizations from different sectors, of course local authorities, but also human rights activists, environmentalists, transport people, gender people, who are precisely thinking that it would be an absolute lost opportunity if we didn't have a strong urban dimension in the new framework for sustainable human development that is currently being discussed at the United Nations. And that strong urban dimension, we believe, is precisely an urban SDG. Just to try to tell you why our grouping, our coalition is sharing that thinking. Basically because we think that we can't afford to send a message that business as usual in urbanization is what we need. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, will be a strong signal for the whole international community. And basically we need to send the signal that urbanization patterns need to change. It's almost a moral imperative to capitalize on this megatrend, precisely to use its mega opportunities to eradicate poverty and inequality within planetary boundaries. And hence we think that an urban SDG could be the right signal to be given to different levels of government, to planners and also to investors. Very importantly as well is if you reflect on the targets that Professor Birch just shared with us right now, the target areas that could be comprised in that goal, it's very important to note that an urban SDG could do two things at a time. Could, on the one hand, continue the unfinished business of the Millennium Development Goals, so make sure that those very critical aspects of human development are living on within the framework of Sustainable Development Goals, and at the same time address new areas which have a huge transformative potential, aspects like inclusive planning, urban planning, or aspects like resilience from the economic, the environmental, and the social processes, and the social perspective, sorry. So from Communitas we have also worked on a series of targets that don't differ dramatically from what Professor Birch has just showed as the key areas around which the Open Working Group is right now working. But I am right now in the United Nations actually following the current session of this Open Working Group. And as we see the process evolve, I think it's becoming crucial that we all collectively within the urban constituency, we step up the efforts around on the advocacy for these urban SDG. We still have to do some work to convince the different members of this Open Working Group about the importance to capitalize on this megatrend, to actually see it as the mega opportunity in terms of prosperity and in terms of, for instance, natural resources management and also poverty eradication. We've been talking about slums, but we can also talk about urban footprint, and we can also remind member states of the United Nations that 70% of the global GDP is actually concentrated in cities. So cities can be a place of prosperity, and that prosperity can actually expand and should expand towards the rural areas with which urban areas are inextricably connected. Very important as well is going to be showing to the members of this Open Working Group that if we look into cities, we are looking and dealing and addressing people's concerns. We are doing more than infrastructure. We are actually talking about the places where things happen, the places where people live, the places where communities can thrive if they are well organized. As well, looking into an urban SDG could actually help leverage that rural-urban nexus, which would speak volumes to balanced rural and urban development. And last but not least, as Professor Eugenie Birch shared with us, it would be essential as well to get across the following message: the possibilities of looking into different critical aspects of sustainability in an integrated and systemic approach. That's what cities can bring us. So these are the arguments that we're going to have to develop or keep developing consistently over a space of a very narrow 3-4 weeks time frame, during which this Open Working Group is going to decide how to narrow down the number of areas, focused areas, as Professor Birch mentioned, that are being currently discussed as precursors of these Sustainable Development Goals, to make sure that the momentum towards an urban SDG is being kept. So what can you do? Well, I'm pretty sure that the following speakers my following fellow speakers could put this also into their own perspective. But if you Google www.urbansdg.org, you could see the clear clarion call of over 250 organizations and cities who have individually signed up to a campaign in favor of an urban SDG for very many different reasons. And you will see that it's a true multi-stakeholder constituency which is behind it, which therefore presents the very strong argument that an urban SDG is not the self-interest of a group of planners or local authorities who are seeking to tick the box of having something for them within this framework of sustainable development goals. And also, very importantly, the City Builders Network launched a campaign. You can actually go to change.org and you will find that campaign, that urban petition, that petition for an urban SDG. Sign up to it, because it's very important to show how individuals and organizations, both levels, are actually engaging and advocating and believing in the importance of this urban SDG. Very importantly as well, if you pertain to organizations with critical know-how in these areas that Professor Birch shared with us, it would be essential that you please engage in the process through the different official channels and through probably each of the organizations that all the speakers in this webinar represent, to help refine the targets and, more importantly, find metrics that would make delegates in the open working group realize that these target areas we are putting forward are measurable, are transformative, and can actually happen because we already know how to handle those data. And last but not least, keep the conversation open as well beyond the open working group of the SDGs, because round the corner in 2016 there will be something called Habitat 3. Habitat 3 will be the first conference of international magnitude of the urban constituency after the adoption of the SDGs, and it will be the place where a true localization of the SDGs framework and a true development of hopefully an urban SDG will happen. Your place to go is called World Urban Campaign, and actually Professor Eugenie Birch is the current chair of that World Urban Campaign. So I'm going to leave it here and pass it on to the following speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Maruxa. It's Mary. I'll just jump in before Cynthia comes on. Just welcome. We now have a number of people that are dialed in. I just want to let people know we've got people coming in from Philadelphia, from Bath, from Annapolis, Maryland, from New York City, from someone who's normally in Kuala Lumpur but happens to be in New York right now. We've got Bury-St. Edmunds. Richard Summers is on with us. That's great, Richard, to have you. Leamington Spa with Clive Harridge, the Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. Great to have you. Someone from Glastonbury, the British Virgin Islands, and other folks that are coming, and someone from Beirut just signed in. Thanks, Aline. We're glad to have you. So I'm going to pass to Cynthia, who will carry on. And again, if people want to start putting questions in, you can. Richard's given me one, and if there are others people want to put in, you can type them in and continue. People that continue to join us, if you haven't logged your city in, please do. Over to you, Cynthia.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cynthia Rosenzweig from NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in Columbia University, and I'm also with RMR Revi, the co-chair of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Sustainable Cities Thematic Group, and participating with my co-chair RMR Revi in the campaign for an urban SDG. Thanks to Mary Rowe and the Municipal Arts Society for organizing this webinar. So let's look at some data about cities and why an urban sustainable development goal is so essential because of the trends of urbanization. The world in 1900, of course, not that many cities with over 750,000 inhabitants, 1.5 billion population in the world. The urban share was only 13%, and the urban share of the world economy only 30% of the 2 trillion. But now let's go to the world in 1950. We see the location of the large cities growing, the urban share growing to almost 30% of the 2.5 billion population, urban share of the gross world product of 7 trillion, now 45%. Turning to today, we're going to change data streams, and this is a very famous, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the City Lights product that's coming from NASA and UN population statistics as well. Now we have our population of 7 billion, and we all know, and this is, I think, a critical point for the need for the urban SDG, that the urban share is now over 50% of the world's population. And look at the urban share of the gross world product, now about 70% of the 70 trillion. Now let's, of the $70 trillion of our global world product. Now let's go to the future. In the next slide. we see the world in 2025 and the projections in which we now are almost city dwellers and human settlement dwellers, about 60% of the 8 billion people in the world, the urban share about 75% of the gross world product. So clearly, if we are thinking about and working to create a sustainable planet, the urban areas and human settlements need to play a vital role. And in the next slide, we see an even a critical challenge that cities are also facing, and the world is also facing, that cities are playing such an important role in responding to a changing climate. So these are the temperature projections of the world in the 2050s, and every city in the world needs to be developing resilience to this, these climate challenges as well. So as in the next slide, the next slide is something that I showed actually yesterday on a panel to the Open Working Group members on the evidence base. And these are some of the slides that I showed yesterday at the UN, that the and providing some input to their deliberations in being able to say that the draft language is very good to build inclusive, safe, sustainable cities and human settlements. That's terrific. Because of what we were just looking at in terms of the role in the economy worldwide, we're giving the members some food for thought on perhaps including productive in as well. But as Jeannie and Maruxa were saying so eloquently, the urban goal is critical to educate leaders and the public on the importance of this global process of urbanization, to basically enlist all of you who are on this webinar and your colleagues and leaders in all cities and local governments around the world to be part of the sustainable development endeavor. Without cities, sustainable development, I believe, and I know Aramar Revi, my co-chair of the SDSN thematic group on cities, also believes that sustainable development is basically impossible if we don't mobilize cities around the post-2015 agenda. So while it's great to have throughout the Sustainable Development Goals mentions of cities throughout, but we also really believe that it's essential to have a standalone urban goal as well, so that it promotes the integrated approaches, the spatial and planning approaches that Jeannie was talking about, vis-a-vis the interdependent, integrated infrastructure, services, and housing systems of cities. The next slide shows these are a combination of the target areas that Jeannie showed, and Maruxa was also speaking, just to pull out, of course, some of the targets having to do with ending slums, ensuring universal aspects to basic services, to improve the urban planning and improve resilience. And not just to the climate shocks that I was talking about earlier when I showed the projections, but also resilience to any kind of shock, be it other natural disasters besides climate, being economic shocks, all different kinds of shocks. This Urban SDG will help cities improve and mobilize resilience planning. And then, of course, to improve the urban environment, cities have always an urban ecology as part of their fabric. The air and the water, the ecosystems within urban areas all need to be protected, nurtured, developed. And finally, it's in cities where consumption and resource consumption can really be part of a leadership movement for the whole planet. The next slide shows the logos of some of the over 250 cities and organizations that have mobilized for the Urban SDG, as was mentioned by Jeannie and Maruxa. Here's some of them, and probably some of you are part of these, and there are many more as well. We couldn't fit all the logos on. But each group that is signing on in each city and each local government that is signing on to the campaign for the Urban SDG is crucially important. When I showed this to the members yesterday, one of the comments after was, "Oh, this is great because it's showing that there will be partners and partnerships for the means of implementation, for implementing the goal, the urban goal, when it becomes reality." So just to end up with the final few points on the next slide, just to say that the implementation of an SDG depends on city and regional governments. They need to be empowered to be able to fulfill their leadership role. This productive cities that I mentioned in the beginning are key to decent jobs, employment for all, and thereby the reduction of poverty, which is, of course, focus area number 1 of the draft of the proposed SDGs. The sustainable infrastructure is absolutely critical, and cities are hubs, but the wider frame of effective land and labor markets and planning, city governments with key regulations, vibrant economies, financing, long-term development, these partnerships of public and private sector entities are critically important in this wider frame. That's what an urban SDG provides. And finally, we want to always reach out beyond cities to the rural areas, to the peri-urban and the rural areas, and with the realization that sustainable cities are not possible without sustainable agriculture, infrastructure, and rural development. So it's not an either-or, urban or rural. It's both sustainable, urban sustainable development goal as well as sustainable agriculture and rural areas. The final slide is some references that I won't go through these, but they'll all be listed on the Metropolitan Arts webinar site, so that these are the background documents, the evidence base that, in part, that has been put together for an urban sustainable development goal, and we look forward to working with you on making this this exciting and crucially important goal become a reality. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cynthia. It's Mary Rowe again, just coming in the middle to introduce our last presenter. And just to remind people that if you've just joined the webinar, please type into the chat or another question, just one of those categories, just put in what city you're coming in from so that we can see where people are coming in. We've had a few additions in the last couple of minutes, so it's terrific to have you. We're about to go to questions, but we'll finish the presentations with Christine Platt, who's the president of the Commonwealth Association of Planners and is speaking to us from Durban. Christine, I just want to remind you that your camera is off on your left, I think.
Yeah, it is off on. It has to be off on my left. I apologize. So I'll try.
That's okay.
Well.
You have a lovely profile, but I'm just letting you know that your audience awaits you. Over to you, Christina. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you very much, Mary, and good evening, everybody from the bottom end of Africa. I'm Christine Platt. I'm the president of the Commonwealth Association of Planners. And just very quickly, in half a minute, for those of you who still find the Commonwealth is something of a mystery, it is an association of, or network of 53 countries represented on all continents of the world and with island states in every ocean of the world. It is a fantastic global laboratory as we represent some of the world's largest countries by population, such as India, and some of the world's smallest, such as some of the Pacific Island states, some of the world's richest, such as the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, and some of the world's poorest, such as places like Mozambique. And also we represent people living and working on some of the world's largest continental land masses, as well as small island states. The Commonwealth is home to some 2 billion people, 1/3 of whom we estimate currently lives in slums. But we have approximately 40,000 planners working in these 53 countries, trying to address the critical challenges that we're having to deal with. The urbanization issue in the Commonwealth is very complex in the sense that in many of the Commonwealth countries we are facing very rapid rates of urbanization, and from the preliminary work we've done on the State of the Commonwealth Cities program, we estimate that the rates of urbanization in the countries of the Commonwealth alone is in excess of 26 million people per year. But that's not the only aspect of urbanization which is important, because we're also very mindful of the fact that in some of the more developed countries in the Commonwealth, we're also facing the critical issue of urban decline, which many people tend to forget about and which is going to become increasingly important certainly in the more developed countries in the decades ahead. What sets the Commonwealth apart, perhaps, as a network for us as people involved in planning is that it offers us institutionalized conduits for the exchange of messages between people working at grassroots, that includes all of us, and our heads of government. I'm not aware of any other professional networks which offer us that kind of conduit for engagement. And we have been using that very critically around this issue of debating the post-2015 agenda and what we're going to do about the SDGs. And I'll sketch very briefly what some of that work has involved. It started in September last year when the Commonwealth Association of Planners presented a pan-Commonwealth paper to the foreign ministers in preparation for our heads of government agenda, arguing that this issue needed to be put on the heads of government agenda for their meeting in Sri Lanka in November last year. And the outcomes of that Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Sri Lanka were, I think, extremely positive. The Heads of Government communique is a very lengthy document, many, many pages long, but critically on the very first page under paragraph 7, the issue of sustainable government was raised, and our Heads of Government committed themselves to sustainable development and to ensuring the promotion of economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable future. Critically, however, they went on in paragraph 9 of the Heads of Government communique, which you will find on the Commonwealth Association of Planners website, to adopt the Colombo Declaration on Sustainable, Inclusive and Equitable Development. Now, this declaration is a very lengthy document as well, but critically it includes a number of hooks that are important for us as people involved in urban and planning issues, because the response that we need to give to our heads of government is, it's all very well that you're committing to a sustainable future and to economic, environmental and economic sustainability, but the question that is left unanswered is, where are you going to address this and how are you going to address this? And our response, I think, to that is very simply that given that more than 80% of the world's GDP is generated in cities, and that by 2030, which is when the SDGs will have the current round of SDGs will have run their course, more than 60% of the world's population will be in cities. If we're serious about addressing the questions of sustainability, the cities in all their forms, as Jeannie said earlier, not just the big metropolitan areas, but the cities is where the focus is going to have to be if these desired goals and these commitments around a sustainable future are going to be met. And I think it's also quite important just to note that although I'm talking particularly from a Commonwealth perspective in the 53 countries of the Commonwealth, it isn't only the Commonwealth heads of government which have committed to this a sustainable urban future. The Leipzig Charter was adopted in 2007 by the European Union countries under the German presidency. And the Leipzig Charter, if you look for it on the website, is in fact entitled the Leipzig Charter on Sustainable European Cities. So the point is, I believe, very simply, that governments around the world are very mindful of the need to address this whole issue around sustainability. And in response to that, we have today released a Commonwealth Association of Planners paper setting out the arguments on why the Commonwealth needs an SDG addressing urbanization and human settlements. And in brief, this paper sets out the background and reminds our governments that the heads of government have already committed to a sustainable future, and therefore, if they want to be deliver on this, the cities is where they're going to have to do that. And we make the case that urbanization is one of the most significant global trends. We make the case that between now and 2030, the Commonwealth will experience more urbanization than any other parts of the world. We also make the case that unless this issue is addressed, cities are in danger of becoming unmanageable. And I think that this is a really crucial point for us to push in this debate around an urban SDG. It's what will happen if we don't have an urban SDG? What will happen if we don't manage the urbanization that we know is going to happen in the course of this century? And as Doug Saunders says in his book Arrival City, we will end the century as a wholly urban species. So what are we going to do? What foundations do we need to lay now between 2015 and 2030 to make sure that we manage the urbanization that we know is going to happen? We make the point in this CAP paper as well that urbanization is a particular challenge in the small island states, and we know from the work that we have done already on the State of the Commonwealth Cities program that some small island states are experiencing rates of urbanization in excess of 200% per annum. I know it's off a small base, but still they don't have the sort of resources that we have in the big metropolitan areas to deal with this enormously rapid increase in their urban populations. And then, of course, critically in the Commonwealth, much of the urbanization that we experience is slum-led, and that critically undermines sustainable development. We know that extreme poverty will only be eradicated if there's a focus on human settlements, and because that is the places where jobs and entrepreneurial opportunity can take people out of poverty. But also we know that these places, the slums, are where high living costs and exclusion from essential services can trap the poor and the marginal in perpetuating poverty. So the conclusion we reached in the paper that we've released today is that an urbanization goal can provide a vital link to the implementation of sustainable development. Commonwealth governments, because of their shared language and legal and institutional traditions and potential for partnerships within and between regions, could take the lead in delivering all SDGs if they propounded and used the urban SDG as their organizing principle. We go on to record that the members of the Commonwealth Association of Planners therefore strongly urges governments to use every opportunity the members of the Commonwealth Association of Planners therefore strongly urges governments to use every opportunity to actively lobby for a dedicated urban SDG at every relevant UN forum. This paper has been sent out today with a request to all of the member countries of the Commonwealth Association of Planners, bearing in mind that we are an association of 53 national institutes. We are nation-based, not individual-based, asking them to lobby their governments to support an urban SDG. We have made a lot of input already into the countries where we know particular lobbying needs to be done, but we're asking all of our member states just to remind their governments that this is an absolutely a crucial issue. And then if I could just end by quoting from the UN High-Level Panel of Eminent Persons on the Post-2015 Development Agenda in their May 2013 report, where they had this most glorious quotable quote, which reads, "Cities are where the battle for sustainable development will be won or lost." And that ties back to what I started off by recording, that our Commonwealth heads of government and the European governments in their Leipzig Charter have said all the right things about sustainable development. We now need to remind them that if they're serious about delivering on that, the cities are where this is going to have to be done. And therefore we really have no option but to push as hard as possible for this urban SDG, to create the context within which these critical issues can be addressed. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. So we're going to go to some questions now. So I'm going to ask the panelists to put their cameras back on so that we can see everybody. So they're answering. So if Jeannie and Cynthia and Maruxa can do that, that'd be great. And the first person, just to remind people that are on the call, you're able to ask a question in this way. You can type a question in, and I will read it, hopefully. And I appreciate all the people that have been typing me things. Thank you. You can also put your hand up. There's a little way for you to signal on that dashboard that you want to ask a question, and I can unmute your microphone and ask you to do that. We'll do a little bit of both. The first question is going to come from Richard Summers, who's in Glastonbury. Richard, I'm going to unmute you, and please, I guess I should go without saying, we've only got 20 minutes, so ask these questions briefly, and I'm sure the panelists will respond briefly as well. So Richard, over to you.
I hope everyone can hear me. I'm recent chairman of the International Committee of the Royal Town Planning Institute. And my question very briefly is this. I think there is a very strong case for an urban sustainable development goal, but how will it fit in with the other proposed sustainable development goals? Indeed, what other sustainable development goals are being considered? My point is that if they don't fit together, the urban SDG, if it's agreed, could just fall into the long grass. Thank you.
Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to do that. Wait, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. So yesterday at the Open Working Group, this was one of the main topics of discussion, and that integration across is very much happening at the target level, so that there will be pointers to, for example, urban areas, inclusion, energy, infrastructure, at the target level across multiple of the what are now being called focus areas, which will be leading into the SDGs. So there is very much an effort, and some of the countries, Maruxa, I know can jump in on this too. For example, Colombia and others, to make sure that they are not that the SDGs, it's a great question, are not siloed, but through the targets will be pointing to each other, creating an integrated fabric towards sustainability.
I'd like to add something here too, which is as the goals and targets are being sorted out, there's a frank effort to make sure that under each goal the targets are related and definitive to that goal. And so when we talk about the safe, sustainable, and inclusive cities and human settlements, we're talking, when you look at the targets, at targets that are quite related, intimately related to two things. Number one, the built environment, space and place. Can't emphasize how important that is, because the other goals tend not to pay attention to the spatial aspects of development. And secondly, to the integrative nature of the city and its ability to integrate the sectoral goals. So the sectoral goals and the integrative goal of the cities go hand in hand together.
Great. I'm going to ask, Richard, I think you need to mute your mic, and just the panelists to mute your mic so you're not speaking. Otherwise, we get lots of heavy breathing, which is distracting but interesting. Here's what we do. Susan, I don't know if I can say your surname. Susan Polwicka, maybe. I'm going to unmute you, Susan. You put your hand up. Ask your question. Go for it. Are you there, Susan? Maybe not. Maybe Susan is no longer there. I'll correspond with Susan and see if I can find where she's gone. In the meantime, we do have a question from, who should we go to next? Yes, Mark. Mark, I'm always counting on you. I'm going to unmute you, Mark. I'm going to unmute your mic, Mark. And Mark Weiss is here. Can you join us and ask your question verbally? Go ahead, Mark.
First of all, congratulations for the wonderful work. Thanks to everyone who's leading this important effort. And my question is for Jeannie and Christine and Maruxa. I'm wondering if you agree with what I thought was a very interesting and good suggestion by Cynthia to add the word productive to cities, to the other three words. So that's my question.
Well, if I can start, I couldn't agree more. I think that if we don't add that word, which could also be linked to prosperity and not just to productivity, not just to growth, we are actually missing a very important element, which is showing how cities are those places of prosperity, those places of productivity for everybody, and that very important rural-urban connection that I was referring to during my first intervention. So to keep it really short, absolutely yes, I think the word productive or prosperous needs to be in there, and the targets and the indicators have to actually help us strike that point. And it's actually a very important aspect of integration across the whole framework of SDGs. If we look into prosperity, well-being, productivity as one more integrative element of an urban SDG with the overall framework of SDGs. Thanks.
Mark, as you well know, cities are centers of productivity by virtue of the agglomeration economies that occur there. And so, of course, productive should be added. We need to re-emphasize and underline the fact that the spatial arrangements of cities allow for the productivity that yields the statistics that Cynthia showed us earlier in terms of the contributions that cities make to their own national GDPs and the world GDPs. So right on with productive.
And then if I could just add my 1 cent worth.
This is Mary. I just want.
Sorry?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just add 1 cent's worth. Mark, yes, I absolutely agree with the previous speakers around that addition, but I think we're going to have to be careful. You know, the negotiations, I think, are very fraught, and some of these things we probably will be left to us to unpack, assuming we get the urban SDG. That's our priority. Let's get the urban SDG, and then in whatever form it comes, and then it's up to us to unpack it.
We've got another question from Stephen, Stephen Harness, who's asking, and we've had this before, those of us that have been presenting on this around the world, some concern that somehow an urban SDG is going to take away from the kind of policy leadership that we need to see for smaller towns, smaller communities, and even rural. So Stephen's asking specifically, you know, should we be thinking of ways that this kind of a goal could also meet the needs of more, to encourage sort of sustainable market towns, smaller towns? Does somebody want to weigh in on that one?
Okay, wait a minute, folks. Let's go back and look at the wording of what this proposed SDG is. We've been saying urban is shorthand, but we are not, and we're using this in a very inclusive way. The wording is safe, inclusive, sustainable cities and human settlements. I cannot emphasize more those last 3 words on human settlements. We are talking about people living in places at differing levels of density, but we're talking about human settlements, we're talking about small towns, we're talking about rural villages, we are talking about cities of all sizes.
Besides that, I mean, Jeannie is absolutely right.
I'm going to add
besides that, I think...
Go ahead, Maruxa.
Yeah, thank you very much. Besides that, I think that we also have to remember about a couple of things. If we look at the target areas we are right now considering and are being considered by member states, which is also very important because, as Christine was saying, this is an eminently political process. We are trying to incorporate language that looks very clearly into that rural-urban connection, into that rural-urban continuum. When you're talking about planning, if you get your planning right, you're basically talking about aspects like resource-efficient use of land. That has a lot to do with land degradation, which is essential for rural development. We're also talking about land tenure, which is again essential for rural development. And we are talking, if we get our planning right, about getting the planning to work at a geographical scale which will consider cities in the wider territories where they are part. So not looking at cities in isolation, but actually cities at the so-called city region geographical scale. which actually in European language, in EU jargon, is something that we call balanced territorial development. Balanced territorial development, which is very much about social cohesion. And then, besides that set of arguments around an urban SDG, second set of arguments is that the whole framework of SDGs is interconnected and is a global framework. And there is another focus area that is particularly looking at sustainable agriculture, food and nutrition, which has a huge element of rural development component. So is not an urban SDG the only place where rural development should be considered. There's also focus areas on growth, economic growth, and there's also focus areas on infrastructure, which are all very pertinent to rural development. So an urban SDG can do a lot if we get planning within that urban SDG for empowering rural development, but at the same time, it's not only an urban SDG who's going to make that all happen, but luckily, the overall framework will be integrated and all goals will be mutually reinforcing. Thanks.
Mary, could I add a word here? Mary?
Sure.
Oh, okay.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. There's something that we've neglected and it will probably be anticipated by other questions, but let me just bring it up right now. When we're talking about a Sustainable Cities and Human Settlements SDG, and we're talking about means of implementation, I think we also have to remember that there's a huge role for nations in the implementation of such an SDG. Nations set standards, minimum standards for national interests such as air pollution or water pollution or whatever that get implemented at the city level, but it is the national framework which is so very important to remember when we talk about what we're thinking about in this particular SDG.
Thanks, Jeannie. We've got a few minutes left, 8 minutes to be precise, and I think we've been talking about the sort of technical case for why we need an SDG, and I think we've clarified that it's an inclusive thing and that it's not going to be at the exclusion of smaller communities or rural areas, and that it's an integrated approach. I think we need to now talk some hardcore strategy, ladies, about how does this vote actually happen. I think all our participants are eager to know who's going to make the decisions, how can they influence those decisions, and what should the set of next steps be that people make to actually get this to happen. So who wants to talk strategy with the gang?
Okay, Mary, can I just respond very quickly? The understanding I have from some of the feedback from people in places like UN Habitat is that governments are saying, well, what does civil society think? And the message that I was getting when we were in Medellin for the World Urban Forum was very much civil society needs to lobby and lobby hard. And I think that's what we've tried to do with this Commonwealth paper that got put out today. The intention is that our member institutes will use those to try and lobby their national governments to say, look, as civil society, an aspect of civil society, we believe this is critically important for these reasons. So I think it's a case of mobilizing the voice of civil society to hopefully give grist to the mill for national governments when they come to debate this in the General Assembly.
Indeed, Christine, I think you're very right. If I could just compliment, I think very important to understand civil society twofold. Civil society is individuals, it's each of us as citizens. We have to get our voice heard and get it across, and there's instruments like the petition that the City Builders Network has engaged in, but also civil society as a specific organizations coming from different backgrounds. I think it is essential to show that this is a multi-stakeholder, clear clarion call that is not just the interest of the people working very specifically in organization, but that actually different sectors, different organizations from different backgrounds are seeing the need to capitalize on this megatrend of the 21st century, which is urbanization, to get it right and get it sustainable. So let's unpack civil society into each of us as citizens and into different organizations with many different backgrounds that can actually show that clear clarion call that I'm talking about.
Anybody else want to talk strategy? Go ahead, Jeannie.
I'd like to mention that we know certain member states have publicly declared support for this particular standalone goal. And I'm going to name them. And if your country is not on this list, It means your country has not expressed publicly support. If you do not hear your country's name, I would suggest you write to your permanent representative, if you feel strongly about this, and ask why that country, your country, is dragging its feet. So here's the list: China, Colombia, France, Germany, Guatemala, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Switzerland, the 54 nations in the African group, and the 15 nations in the Caribbean community have all endorsed publicly this goal. Repeat, if your country is not on this list, get working.
Yeah, please, Cynthia, go again. Go ahead. Go ahead.
This is Mary. I don't know, Cynthia, I think you're trying to get on. I hope you can. So there were some notable absences from that list, including countries in which many of our callers are currently residing in. So we heard our marching orders. Okay, Maruxa first, and then Cynthia. Go ahead, Maruxa.
Even more importantly, let me be the naughty girl in the panel. There is a country, and I know that I've just heard that we got eminent participants in the webinar with us from that country. Is the UK. It's a country which has been particularly outspoken against an urban SDG, considering that the best approach to incorporate urbanization within the SDGs would be mainstreaming urbanization in other different focus areas, in other different SDGs. That is indeed an approach, but it's an approach that would miss out very critical aspects, and maybe two obvious examples are public space and planning. Where do you place those? Do you place planning under a goal on employment? Do you place planning under a goal on growth? Where do you put urban planning? So those of you participating in this webinar from the UK with a relevant positions, connections, and will to try to engage in an open conversation with the UK government, please help. Because the UK government has, of course, an important traction within the European Union negotiating group.
Good. And I'd like to also say for all groups, no matter which country you are from, and whether it be an NGO or a university department or a government agency, if you could you could please join the campaign for an urban SDG. One way to do that is at www.urbansdg.org. And please join the many groups. When I showed those logos just yesterday, people I could tell in the audience from the member states were saying, oh yes, there really is widespread support for this standalone urban SDG, and they see that can be helping with all of the groups really standing together for this. That there is not just it's achievable, but then to get the goal itself, but then the means of implementation will be there will be able to be partnerships formed. So please do sign up with your organization at www.urbansdg.org. And we thank you very, very much.
So I'm just going to take us home now because we're just 2 minutes out from ending this. So Courtney's put a slide up, as you can see, that shows our resources and gives you a list of the various places, including the one that Cynthia just put up, mentioned urbansdg.org. We also have a petition on change.org where we have a couple of hundred people. We'd like to have double that, have a couple more hundred people. So that's something that you can put out to all your networks. We hope you will. This is the first webinar that we've done for the Global Network. We'd like to continue to do these. So I've had a number of questions from folks that have broader topics that they'd like to have covered that we just don't have the time to cover here. So I hope you'll stay in contact with us. We can do these webinars monthly on other topics that are of interest to people doing laudable work around making cities more livable and resilient around the world. So please be in touch with us. Courtney has your email, so you'll be hearing from her. And would you just all join me? We'll virtually thank Christina and Maruxa and Cynthia and Jeannie for giving us the great briefing on the importance of an urban SDG. Thank you, ladies. And we encourage everyone on the call to hunker down. You heard Jeannie say it's time to get working for us to continue to push this on. One last question to you, Jeannie, would be the ultimate timing of this. what is the ultimate timing that we should see that will play out over the next couple of months?
Now, basically,
Okay.
no, it's critical. We have an extremely narrow window. The OWG is meeting this week. The chairs yesterday announced that they are going to produce a zero draft, which means that's the draft that gets negotiated before the mid-June meeting. I would say that's going to be in the next couple of weeks that will come out because they have to give people a little time to look at it. So there is a certain urgency to action right now because we have 16 focal areas. There will not be 16 focal areas or goals in the end. There will be 8, 10, or 12. And the Elimination Musical Chairs Act is now occurring. So I cannot emphasize how critically important it is that if you feel strongly about this, as strongly as your speakers today feel, I hope you will join us in using every resource at your fingertips to show your support to your representatives for this goal. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks to all our participants and to our panelists very much, and we look forward to hearing more about how we can make some progress on that. Very good.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.